And thanks for joining me, everyone. Charles Moscowitz here, live at YouTube and at all subscribing networks. And my guest was switching gears a little bit today, and we're going to be discussing more philosophical matters and getting away from the hard news that I usually cover. My guest is Pascal Konneh. He is the author of the new book, Crimes in the Name of Liberty: The Dictatorship of Western Democracies and the Suffering It Causes Around the World. Pascal, thank you for joining me this afternoon.
Thank you very much for having me, Charles.
Pascal, first of all, if you don't mind, talk a little bit about yourself and how you have arrived at this book and this manuscript.
Charles, once again, thanks for having me. I am African. I'm born and raised in Africa. I had my basic education in Africa, and then I went off to study in Germany. And after my university education, I joined the oil industry, and I've been blessed and privileged to travel around the world as part of my job, and have seen, quite apart from the job that I do, also the impact of the geopolitics that all of the nations have around the world.
And your view on geopolitics has to do with the phenomena of the international oil industry?
Not only it has, that is part of it. What I have seen is really the manner in which the interest-driven policies of countries end up affecting the common men and women and children in far-off countries. And of course, the oil and gas is a key part of the interest of these countries. So yes, it does play a part.
Now, you say that the Western democracies have capitalized on and monetized human suffering. I think that conventionally speaking, that would be true with regard to colonialism, international conquest, particularly in the 19th century, the conquest of Africa by the big European powers and Asia, but yet you seem to say that this process is continuing today, even though Africa particularly, but most countries in Asia as well and South America have been able to obtain sovereignty and have at least what we think is control over their own respective nations. So is that the case? Do I have that right, that it's the colonial legacy that is continuing to exploit?
Yes, you are right, Charles. On paper, colonialism is over. Slavery is over. So we're in the 21st century, and theoretically, all of the nations that form the Commonwealth of Nations in the world are independent and sovereign and minding their own business and having their own destinies in their hands. That is the theory. In theory also, the parliaments and the systems of government in the Western world have developed to a point where they categorically forbid their governments from intervening in other countries, from sponsoring coup d'etats, or from influencing who rules which country, whether it's in the United Kingdom or in the United States. Parliament and Congress are clearly against these kind of actions. That also is the theory. Now, the reality of daily politics today is totally different. On the colonialism side, you have what we call neo-colonialism that is still going on, where former colonial powers continue to maintain a very significant degree of control behind the scenes over their former colonial territories. And that has ramifications on the ability of these nations to maintain their sovereignty and to control their own affairs as they should, or as the world thinks they are on paper. On the other side, what is really happening in terms of the foreign policies of Western nations is that there are, while on paper they are sitting back and allowing other nations to mind their business, we see that these nations always find justifications or legitimations to get involved in other countries' business. And the consequences are horrendous. Whether you're talking about Libya or Iraq or Syria or Ukraine, you see clear instances of Western nations getting involved in other people's issues, ostensibly to bring about positive change. But what you end up seeing is that A, this was strongly linked to Western interests, and B, the consequences that are left behind are that the people are much worse off than they were when we moved in.
Well, I think you make a very good case. I mean, you bring up one obvious example recently, which is Libya, where you had Muammar Gaddafi actually beginning to move toward an African Union, not necessarily actual, but certainly a closeness of the African nations and an African currency that would not be dependent upon international monetary systems, and that would be, a currency by which would be set by Africans. And it was around that time that, of course, the United States, operating completely illegally, began to fire missiles at Libya and eventually murdered Gaddafi and destroyed that dream. You talk about coup d'etats and instability in governments. We have seen that in third world countries. We are seeing it unfold right now in the United States for the first time, with an attempt by the Democratic Party and the corrupt elements to overthrow the Trump administration by use of not coming out and storming the Capitol, and see, but they have, at least metaphorically, seized the radio station and the means of communication. They have the big trumpet in the form of high tech, big tech, and the big three, and they're able to control the high ground at this point. So we're seeing this unfold here. But I guess that what I would ask you is that, it comes down to more of almost a spiritual question, a moral question, which is that if these individual countries, whether it be the United States, whether it be Cameroon, whether it be any country, Pakistan, if they have the will to control their own destinies internally, then they could immunize themselves from both these sorts of internal machinations by which their governments are overthrown, and also these, imperialistic and exploitative external forces like the International Monetary Fund and other external entities that want to crush their ability to genuinely exercise real sovereignty. So do you think that I have something on that in terms of how a nation itself can develop to improve its own posture? And is that possible?
You make a very good point, Charles. And I think it's always, as with everything else in life, it is extremely important to separate these issues. First of all, we have to give each party their own responsibility in each situation. For example, Libya, of course, there is a part of the responsibility that goes to the Libyan leadership, because it's not for nothing that they were singled out. And there is a part of the responsibility that goes on the powers that invaded Libya. Now, I have to state that I do not particularly care for Mr. Gaddafi as an individual or as a leader.
Right, neither do I, but that's not our business.
Exactly.
I mean,
we care about the Libyan people and what led up to the invasion of Libya. Now, to the question of how much influence do the individual countries have over their destinies, some more than others, because I think people don't realize just how powerless some nations are to the external influences in the context in which they operate. And again, we always see there are things within your sphere of influence, and there are things that are outside of your spheres of influence. In a lot of countries like Libya and Cameroon, we can hold the governments to account for those things that are within their sphere of influence. Little things like public health, like public education, like transport, like the rule of law, like freedom of speech. Those are things that are happening within their own sovereign territory, Charles. And they are responsible and accountable for those things because they are within their influence. Now, the interests of powerful external nations in your country, those are things that invariably fall within those things that are outside of your sphere of interest. As a country, neither the government of Cameroon nor the people of Cameroon can say that they have the wherewithal to manage or resist these powerful external interests. They just don't. And that is where part of the book talks about the media, the press. And we don't, certainly from my perspective as an author, unfortunately, I cannot say that the media has been open, objective, and unbiased when the Obama administration went into Libya and did the things that they did.
Right.
The media was there and they could see that the Obama administration, and again, let me state quite clearly that I am not in the United States, I'm not involved in US politics, and I really couldn't care less whether Mr. Trump or Mr. Biden win the presidency. But we are talking about processes and the involvement of the media. The media could see that the Obama administration and their partners went into Libya in violation of the United Nations Security Council resolutions. They can see that the net impact of that intervention has left the Libyan nation far worse than it was. A lot more civilians are dying than ostensibly the partners went in to save. The migrant crisis in the Mediterranean was clearly a result of that intervention. Slave trade is thriving in Libya today, and Libya is a broken state until today. And the media have connived to leave that largely out of people's bedrooms. And you can argue that similar forces may or may not be happening in the United States today with the presidential election. Again, as an outsider, I don't want to get involved in that. I don't want to take sides. The only thing I can say about that is, yes, the media can call individual states to one candidate or the other. Yes, the media can say, okay, this candidate has provisionally crossed the 270 electoral votes threshold. Congratulations to them and their supporters. But in a situation where you have the other candidate filing legal suits and contesting the results, the Constitution allows for another process to kick in. Whether or not you agree with that process, whether or not you agree with those things, you have got to wait for that to play out before you can come out and say, we have a president-elect. We have a candidate who has done well, who has provisionally cleared that barrier. Congratulations to them. But in my very humble opinion, you do not have a president-elect until that constitutional process has concluded.
Well, I mean, you're saying it exactly right. I mean, there is no presidential elect until the process is concluded and the president has been certified.
Exactly.
And right now,
sorry to cut in there, Charles. If one candidate would concede and congratulate the other, then you have a president-elect.
That's right. That's right. And right now we're behaving like a lot of third world countries have behaved, in that you have somebody marching in and declaring themselves, and they get the backing of the big horn in the media because they've got their...
And my point there is very similar to where we are seeing clear violations of international law in foreign interventions, and the media is there and they see it and they don't step up and say anything. I am of the impression, and that is really my personal opinion, that we're seeing something similar in the United States. I would be very happy to see one media outlet stand up and say, hang on, why do we have a president-elect when these constitutional electoral processes are still running?
It's very troubling, and it's unprecedented in American history. Now, you mentioned that Obama was, flying missiles at Libya, and he destroyed African nationalism or damaged it probably for a generation by doing so. I think that it's important to tie that into what's going on now, because Obama, like most other presidents since World War II, maybe with the one exception of JFK, was a stooge of this international establishment. He was a puppet. He was part of this idea of perpetual war around the world in order to promote some kind of a softening toward a world order. And Donald Trump has stood up to that, and that's why they're trying to take him out. He has not, he has de-escalated America's military actions around the world, and he has acted in the interests of his own country with the hope that other nations would do likewise in their own countries. And I think that has everything to do with the coup d'etat that we are now seeing unfold inside the United States. Now, I want to get back to talking about Africa a bit more, because I think that Africa is a continent that has such incredible potential.
Absolutely.
It has great diversity and great human intellect and power and enormous potential in every area that you can name. But I think one of the problems with Africa is that when colonialism was finally defeated after World War II and right up until the early 1960s, a lot of the leaders that came to power in Africa, the early leaders like Kenyatta and Nkomo and others, these people were socialists. They were trained at Oxford and at Cambridge and at the Sorbonne. They were, they did not understand, nor did they support the idea of enhancing the rights of their own citizens to develop property and to develop industry and to develop labor and capital and all of the things and the institutions that create a free society. Instead, they wanted to be socialist, and they wanted to rule, in a sense, in an authoritarian way, and to do so from the top down under the name of this sort of, this utopian idea. And I think that because of that, it has been a tragedy for Africa. They did not, were slowed down in their ability to create these strong, sovereign, free nations that could have functioned in the best interests of their own citizens. I mean, Cameroon is a perfect example of that.
Yes, I think, again, you make a really good point, Charles. Before I go into this point about African socialism, let me just very quickly go back to the Obama administration and how they acted globally, to your comments there. Now, to what extent they were a puppet of the system, I cannot say. But one thing that you can see, and it's a very strong concern, is the media is once again focusing so much on Donald Trump today and on this transition. And my concern there is that people then become oblivious to whatever the next administration comes in and does. So you see these almost this two-faced character of the media, where we're so focused on Donald Trump and everything that he does. And then if the Biden administration comes in, congratulations to them, then what I'm hoping does not happen is that they go on with the kind of policies that we saw in Egypt and Libya and Syria.
Oh, they already are talking about it.
And nobody talks about that.
No, you're absolutely.
Talks about that. And that is where my concern comes in. If the media is going to be as spotlighting as they are on Trump now, we are going to make sure, or we're going to look to them to have exactly that focus spotlight on an eventual Biden administration. If it should come in, we want to see that spotlight on them throughout their 4 years or 6 years or however long they will be in every aspect of their foreign policy. That is my concern, and hopefully of their national policy as well in America. Now, to your point about post-colonial African leaders. Listen, Charles, African history post-colonialism is an extremely complex and difficult element to see. Mm-hmm. First of all, I look at the context in which, I'm not trying to make excuses for them, the context in which the immediate post-colonial African leaders were operating in the 1950s and 1960s and 1970s was a very murky environment of continued colonial influence and getting into a totally new zone or a totally new frontier. Basically, they were in uncharted territories, and they had to make decisions with the means that they had at their disposal at the time, rightly or wrongly. Today, in hindsight, it is very easy for somebody like myself to see the mistakes that they made and criticize them. And those mistakes are there, like you said. I don't see that a lot of those governments put the foundations in place for a free market economy to develop and thrive and be competitive today. But then it's easy to look back in hindsight and criticize them. What we can say is that the governments that are there today, they have, again, a sphere of influence that, they have a scope of things that are within their influence, and they have a scope of things that are outside their influence. And we have to hold them to account for those failings that they have for those things that are within their sphere of influence. Many of the countries, whether it's Cameroon or Libya or up and down Africa, we will see that the governments, they have succeeded in areas and they have failed significantly in other areas in terms of preparing their countries to be competitive. But at the same time, as an African, I would be remiss if I don't point out that the external influences that are acting on Africa and on Africans and on African leaders are extremely strong. The global system has to take a look at the impact of Western and other nations on Africans and really try and understand how these policies affect the ability of African nations to develop themselves and to thrive. Look at Libya, for example. Just the fall of Libya alone, quite apart from the economic impact on the Libyans, quite apart from the economic or quite apart from the fact that Libya is no longer available to contribute economically to the development of the continent, we have had a proliferation of terrorism and of arms. Talk about Boko Haram getting arms that resulted from the broken Gaddafi arms.
Right, the instability that resulted from that.
The instabilities that you cannot underestimate the economic impact of the instability that are caused by these kind of events. And this is something that Cameroon did not ask for. We woke up one morning and Boko Haram was there. And we have to dedicate a significant amount of our country's resources to dealing with this threat that we had no fault in its emergence.
No, exactly. I mean, it destabilized the entire West Africa.
Absolutely.
And also, I think that unfortunately, God forbid, I mean, Biden is able to seize power. They're already waving, shaking the saber at Iran, and they're trying to blame Trump for that. They're already starting with this guy Blinken, as their foreign policy guy, who's a warmonger and who wants to start fighting in Syria. They want to use the Middle East as the lever to destabilize the world and start once again into these perpetual wars that the United States and the internationalists have been involved in since World War II.
And nobody is talking about the consequences of these wars on countries.
Now, you say no one's talking about it, and you get into this in your book, Crimes in the Name of Liberty, and that is that they're not talking about it because they have essentially taken over the media. They've done it over many, many decades by gradually working their own people up the rat line and expunging those who do not conform, while consolidating their control over something like, I think it's now 4 or 5 media mega entities that own everything. And I think that the conformity of this is now really coming home to roost in the form of the big high-tech companies like Twitter and Facebook and YouTube and the rest, who are nice enough to carry this show, by the way, and I'm glad for that. But that they're engaging in overt and obvious acts of censorship against anyone who speaks out against the official liberal opinion. And it looks like they are hermetically sealing the transfer of knowledge and communication so that it fits their own agendas, and that it weeds out anything that might not fit in. What do you think, Pascal? Is that the case as you see it?
I think I have not really looked at the influence of the social media and the technological media and the new media. I know that I've heard many people mention that as an area of concern, but look, every time that you have that amount of power concentrated within one company, that is going to create a knock-on effect. And what I have studied is the impact of the conventional media, and there is no way you can deny that there is a symbiotic relationship between the conventional media and the states. Certainly, of course, listen, Charles, let me backtrack a little bit. When I talk about Western nations a lot in my book, this is not because I have some kind of an obsession about Western nations. No.
Right, of course.
The aspect, the deeds and misdeeds of nations like Russia and China, they are like the beaten track. They've been discussed by everybody daily, every week, and I think everybody kind of knows what they do or what they don't or what they haven't done. What has not been talked about is the involvement and the impact or the activities of Western democracies. Now, if we take a look at what happened in Syria, for example, in 2014, the US Army is operating in Syria, ostensibly to fight against ISIS. At the same time, mainstream media is reporting that ISIS is getting its money from selling Syrian oil. To whom?
That's a good question.
To whom? Oil is not
the oil companies. Yeah.
Oil is not a service that you can sell from your bedroom. To make $1 million from selling oil, you need 100 tanker trucks of that particular commodity. Someone has to see it. And the global media know that the US Army was aware of whoever is moving these tanker trucks. The Pentagon admitted that a few days after the Paris bombings. The media know that, and in my opinion, that would be the equivalent of a 21st century Watergate.
It's an interesting
Nothing happened.
context anyways. I mean, the oil business, even during World War II, I mean, Standard Oil kept oil flowing from the Canary Islands right into Nazi Germany. I mean, it didn't stop for 1 minute. So the oil, international oil is not.
That is where we observe and can criticize mainstream media in terms of what they do and what they don't do. Now, to what extent the new media, social media, and the big media technology companies like Facebook, WhatsApp, Twitter, YouTube are moving in that direction as well, I cannot say that I have studied that very much, but it would be of significant concern if they start moving in that direction as well.
Well, I mean, I think that we now see, in this past year, that they clearly have moved in that direction. They are taking down stations and hosts and people who speak out in a way that doesn't fit their narrative. And there can be nothing more obvious than this election, because they're actually censoring the president of the United States. I mean, it's it's right out there and it's up front. So Pascal Konneh, the book is Crimes in the Name of Liberty. It's published by Exibris. It's available at bookstores. It's available at Amazon. Talk a little bit about where the African nations are today in terms of what they can do to emerge from this malaise and begin to once again reassert their sovereign rights as independent nations.
Thank you very much, Charles. That's a topic that I'm very excited about. There is a lot going on in Africa. There is a term that has been coined for new emerging countries, the N11, the next 11. These are countries like Indonesia, the Philippines, and Nigeria is right. In fact, 2 of these N11 countries are in Africa. That's Egypt and Nigeria. Nigeria is on the cusp, is right on the border to becoming a G20 nation when you look at GDP measured by purchasing power parity. There's a lot going on. The size of the population in Nigeria, the size of the economy in Nigeria, you add Egypt to it and you add South Africa to it, we have these 3 really big engines of economic growth that are driving the African economy. We have a lot of very positive stories, whether you're looking at Botswana or Rwanda or even Cameroon. We have lots of really positive stories that are happening around the continent. If we can just maintain this momentum, and keep focusing on good governance, then you will see the economic development will happen by itself. China is not going to continue to grow the way that it is doing by itself, even without all of the trade issues that are happening between the US and China, Charles. The Chinese, they realize it themselves that their economy is at a stage where it cannot keep growing in double digits. They will have to move their economy, extend or expand their economy to somewhere else. I'm very excited about the prospects that will be going to places like India, Latin America, and into Africa in the next 5 to 10 years and going forward.
What about the phenomena of these continuously and lingering corrupt governments that have controlled countries, not just in Africa, but I point to Latin America, Central America, parts of Asia, even Central Asia, where you have dictators who aren't leaving, where you have them, in control of the institutions. And I mean, that's going to be a tough one to overcome. And that's going to be like a millstone around the neck of these otherwise thriving nations that are, as you say, breaking out in every way.
Corruption is a very, very big issue. I think everybody, the whole world recognizes that corruption is a big issue, and that corruption is a leading hindrance to the development of Africa and of third world countries in general. Unfortunately, I do not have any clear proposals. My book has very clear proposals on what needs to be done and what can be done to reduce the conflicts around the world. I cannot say that I have very clear proposals on what needs to be done to reduce corruption in these countries, because we have seen over the decades, Charles, we have seen anti-corruption initiatives, whether it's in Latin America or in Africa or in Asia. They come and they go and the practices remain. The only thing I can say is that corruption is a two-way thing. For the African governments to receive corruption, someone is giving that corruption. And the question is, who is it? It's not the African citizens because they don't have money to corrupt them. It's not fellow African countries because they also don't have the money to corrupt them. So the question is, who is doing the giving part of the corruption? And up until now, we have focused so much on the countries that are doing, and the leaders, the governments that are supposedly doing the receiving part of the corruption. I think one thing that I may propose just out of the box is maybe it's time to turn the spotlight in the other direction and start looking for who are on the giving side of the corruption. When we get that, then maybe we can solve the problem.
Well, Pascal, let's go right to that. Who is? I mean, one name that comes to my mind is George Soros. I think that you have people on an international level who have meddled into the affairs of smaller nations around the world. They've manipulated their currency in a way that enriches them and destabilizes their governments. These are the very type of currency manipulations that led to World War I. So, I mean, I don't know much about Africa, and I don't know if Soros is meddling there. He's certainly meddling in this country and in European countries like Hungary. But in Africa, I don't know. So who is doing the machinations in Africa?
That is a very good question. That's a very good question. Unfortunately, I don't have that $60 million question, but I am sure that there are others who can turn the spotlight in that direction. All that I can say, Charles, is that I thank you very, very much for giving me this opportunity and for looking into the potential and the future of Africa. And one thing I can tell you, as an African, Africa has tremendous and all that we are asking for, we are not asking for handouts or for aid or for any of that. No, we are asking for a level playing field. If Africa gets a level playing field without neo-colonial or masters supporting dictators, without the giving side of corruption fueling the corruption on the continent, if we can get a level playing field that does not have all of these other destabilizing influences that are outside of our spheres of influence, we will rock.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I'll just finish with a quick anecdote. I mean, this is a story that I came across. One of the things that I do in Boston, besides radio and writing books, is that I drive Uber. And I had a passenger, this young man from Africa, he was from Nigeria, who was here visiting his brother, who was a student at Harvard, and he was extremely wealthy. He was staying at the best hotel. And he told me that he's making a fortune in Africa selling instant telephones. And he said that Africa is a continent of enormous potential in business. And one of the reasons they have such potential is that they're not saddled by some of this old infrastructure that the United States and Europe are saddled with. And they don't have these layers and layers of bureaucracy with laws that hurt business like the United States has. So, there's not the old telephone lines. So he could go to countries and open them up and sell them these phones. And it's like the Wild West. He says it's fantastic. He's making a fortune. He's going to be, and to me, that tells me that Africa is on the cusp of a huge surge economically and hopefully spiritually. And I just really appreciate that. And I just, as you said, I mean, one of the obstacles is getting rid of these corrupt governments and getting rid of some of these foreign interferences by internationalists.
Exactly, I agree. Look, every country has its problems, Charles. And you can see, we are witnessing at the moment that even big, successful, wealthy countries like America, they have their problems. And you have to sympathize. Apart from the constitutional issues that America is looking at the moment, you have issues about emergence of other powers in the world like Russia and China, which the United States will have to deal with these powers going forward, one way or the other, whether it's through this way or the other way. And those are things, those are problems. That's a headache that the United States has to deal with. The United States is moving into an era now whether there are question marks on whether it can still lead by innovation or whether it has to lead by holding back the likes of China from innovating. And those are questions that the United States has to grapple with in the next few years. And I have every confidence that it will reinvent itself and come out as the innovative country that has been driving the world so far. Europe has its own problems, significant issues in Europe, whether it's the immigration problems, or whether it's migration problems, or whether it's other issues on the continent. Europe is dealing with issues at the moment where it is going to have to reinvent itself, be able to deal with these issues, and then move into the 21st century on that basis. Africa has its own very unique set of issues. But with those issues also come opportunities. While we have these leadership issues and these political issues and issues that are linked to our history, which is a very recent history, by the way, people forget that most African countries only got independent in 1960.
Yeah, exactly. It's a new continent.
We have a very young history, but it is by no means excusing the mediocrity that we may have had, but it is explaining the context in which some of these chaotic things are happening. And at the same time, we have enormous potential to where if influencers and leaders keep putting the spotlight on some of the external influences that are holding us back, and also putting the spotlight on our governments to deal with the issues that are within their sphere of influence. And then we look at the developments in global trade with China starting to peak and China themselves recognizing that Africa is going to play a very important role in their development in the next decades. There is tremendous opportunity in Africa, not to mention the incredible human capital that we have in Africa. These are men and women who are incredibly resilient, who are extremely intelligent, whom if you give them half a chance, they take it and turn it into something great. This generation, this young generation of Africans, I'm extremely optimistic about them.
Oh, absolutely. And I'm very glad to play a small role in alerting America to Africa and its politics and in helping in some small way. I really appreciate it. Pascal, let my viewers know where they can get your excellent book and any other information you'd like to share.
Crimes in the Name of Liberty is available on Amazon in all countries. It's also available on Ex Libris website at exlibris.com. And of course, you can always visit the book's own website at crimesinthenameofliberty.org.
All right, Pascal Konneh, I want to thank you very much for joining me this afternoon.
Thank you, Charles. Hope to be on your